The moment the human screamed, the entire classroom froze. Professor Yilreth stopped mid-lecture, his tendrils curling in alarm. The lecture hall, usually filled with the quiet hum of alien students taking notes, was now silent except for the ragged breathing of the human, who clutched his arm at an unnatural angle. A few students recoiled, their skin shifting colors in distress. What in the name of the great archivist just happened? Yilreth demanded, his bulbous eyes fixed on the human. The human, who had introduced himself on the first day as Jake, let out a shaky breath. I think I dislocated my shoulder. A ripple of horrified murmurs spread through the class. Dislocated, a Zelthian student named Vryn asked, his voice high-pitched with alarm. Did someone attack you? Did your arm attempt to separate from your body? No, Jake said quickly, though he winced when he shifted. I just moved the wrong way when I reached for my datapad, and he inhaled sharply, sweat beading on his forehead. It popped out. Your limb. Detached itself, another student pressed, their translucent crest pulsating with unease. Not detached, Jake corrected, his voice strained, just out of place. Yilreth's tendrils twitched. This is an emergency. We must get you to the medical bay immediately. Jake hesitated. Yeah, but he gritted his teeth and shifted in his seat. I can fix it myself. Silence. Silence. Yilreth's elongated head swayed side to side, his species equivalent of disbelief. Fix it yourself. Jake nodded. I just need a second. The aliens exchanged glances. A few students leaned away as if expecting something catastrophic. Do humans regularly endure their own bodily damage without medical intervention? Vryn asked, his skin darkening with unease. Not regularly, Jake admitted, still clutching his arm, but this has happened to me before. The room seemed to constrict with tension. Wait, another student piped up. You mean this has happened more than once? Yeah, Jake said, exhaling sharply. It's not that uncommon. The class reacted as if he'd confessed to spontaneous combustion. A student from the Othrex species, whose carapace gleamed under the artificial lighting, turned to Yilreth. Professor, should we restrain him? He might be delirious. I'm not delirious, Jake said flatly. Then you're simply reckless, Vryn exclaimed. You should be in a sterile environment with professionals attending to your injury. Jake gave a strained chuckle. Not exactly an option in the middle of a lecture. Then we end the lecture, Yilreth declared. You require immediate attention. Jake shook his head. It's not that serious. He adjusted his grip on his arm, bracing himself. The students collectively leaned forward, their various appendages twitching in anticipation. Wait, Vryn pleaded. You are not seriously planning to. Jake didn't wait for him to finish. With one sharp motion, he twisted his arm and shoved his shoulder back into place. There was an audible pop. Half the class screamed. A Zelthian fainted in their seat. One of the Othrex students bolted for the exit, their clicking limbs scrambling against the floor. Yilreth's tendrils shot straight up, his eyes wide with horror. What have you done? Jake groaned but flexed his fingers experimentally. Okay, he breathed. That was rough. You just, Vryn stammered, his skin fluctuating between 3 different colors. You just reset your own limb, like some kind of deranged biological construct. Jake rolled his shoulder, still wincing. Not ideal, but better than waiting around. Better than. Yilreth seemed to struggle for words. You are a danger to yourself and to those around you. Jake blinked. I just fixed it. You just forced part of your body back into place. Yeah. That's how it works. Several students looked genuinely ill. One was making a high-pitched keening noise, which Jake suspected was the equivalent of hyperventilating. You humans, an Othrex student muttered, their voice shaking. You are terrifying. Jake sighed, rubbing his now functional shoulder. I swear this isn't a big deal. Not a big deal, Vryn repeated weakly. You mutilated yourself before our eyes. That's not mutilation, Jake protested. It was already out of place, I just put it back. You did it without medical guidance. Jake hesitated. I mean, yeah, but... Professor, one of the students said urgently, I think we need to report this to the administration. The human is clearly unstable. Jake groaned. Oh, come on. If your species casually does this sort of thing, how are you still alive? Vryn demanded. Jake exhaled. Look, I get it. This is weird for you guys. But it's normal for humans to deal with stuff like this when we have to. I didn't have time to sit around and wait for a doctor, so I handled it. Ylreth looked shaken. This is not normal behavior. For you, Jake said. For humans, it's not that unheard of. The professor's tendrils curled, his expression unreadable. I need a moment to process this. Jake leaned back in his seat, his shoulders still sore but functional. Take your time. The rest of the class, however, continued to stare at him as if he had just announced he could survive in vacuum. Jake had a feeling this was not the end of the conversation. Ylreth dismissed the class early. The students filed out in a daze, casting Jake wary glances as if he might suddenly detach another limb just to prove a point. Jake sighed, rotating his shoulder as he stood. It still ached, but at least it was functional. He hadn't expected this much of a reaction. Sure, it wasn't pleasant to watch, but the sheer level of distress had been excessive. Vryn lingered by the exit, hesitating before finally speaking up. You should go to the medical bay, he said, his skin still slightly dimmed, the equivalent of someone recovering from a scare. Jake exhaled, rubbing his neck. I'll be fine. I know my limits. Vryn's gaze flicked to Jake's shoulder, then back to his face. That is precisely what concerns me. Jake didn't have a good response to that, so he just shrugged carefully and left the lecture hall. By the time he reached the dormitory, the rumors had already spread. The shared common area was unusually quiet when he entered. Conversations paused. Eyes multiple, in some cases, tracked his movements. He pretended not to notice as he grabbed a drink from the dispenser. Finally, a voice broke the silence. You really did it. Jake turned to see Rilvan, a tall, avian-like student whose species, the Varaxi, prided themselves on their meticulous approach to bodily care. Rilvan's feathers were puffed slightly, a gesture Jake had learned meant unease. Did what Jake asked, though he knew exactly what Rilvan was referring to. You forcibly corrected your own skeletal displacement. Jake sighed. I put my shoulder back in place, yeah. Murmurs spread through the room. Someone let out a low huffing sound, the equivalent of disbelief. Rilvan clicked his beak. Without a stabilizing brace? Without a med tech. Yes, Jake said flatly. An Othrex student, Jorik, rubbed the ridges of his mandibles. And this is common among humans. Jake hesitated. Not common, exactly, but not unheard of. Rilvan narrowed his many eyes. Then why? Jake took a sip of his drink, considering. Because sometimes you don't have a choice. You fix it, or you stay injured longer than necessary. I've seen people do worse to keep moving. The room went silent again. Jorik's carapace darkened slightly. Worse. Jake exhaled. I don't mean for fun or anything. Just when you need to. Humans don't heal as fast as some species, so sometimes we have to improvise. A student from the aquatic species, the Thryn, made a low, warbling noise. That is troubling. Jake rubbed his temple. It's just different. Not better, not worse, just different. Rilvan didn't look convinced. You are telling me that your species regularly endures injuries and simply deals with them. Jake shrugged again, though he made sure to do it with the uninjured shoulder. More or less. Jorik tapped his claws against the table. And you do not find this concerning? Jake let out a short laugh. I never really thought about it until today. Rilvan ruffled his feathers. Then perhaps you should. Jake sighed again. Look, I get that this is weird for you all, but I swear, this isn't some extreme thing. Humans just adapt. Jorah considered that for a moment. I suppose that explains how your species has survived despite its physiological disadvantages. Jake arched a brow. Thanks, I think. Rilvan shook his head. It is not an insult. It is simply baffling. Jake smirked. Yeah, well, welcome to humanity. The students didn't seem entirely reassured, but the conversation shifted, and the tension in the room eased slightly. Jake had a feeling this wasn't the last time he'd have to explain himself. Jake woke up to an inbox flooded with messages. Some were from classmates still trying to process what they had witnessed. Others were from students he didn't even know, asking if the rumors were true. One particularly dramatic message simply read, "Are you still intact?" He groaned and shut the terminal. Apparently his shoulder incident had become the most talked about event on campus. His day only got stranger from there. As he walked through the main hall toward his next class, students parted around him, not in the usual way people made space, but with a deliberate, wary distance. Conversations hushed when he passed. A few individuals observed him with a mixture of curiosity and concern, their expressions difficult to interpret across so many species. Jake tried to ignore it, but it was hard to pretend nothing was happening when even his usual study group hesitated before acknowledging him. Rilvan clicked his beak as Jake sat down. "You are surprisingly mobile." Jake sighed. "I told you, it wasn't as bad as it looked." Vryn, who had previously been so alarmed in class, leaned in. "We spoke with a medical professional about what you did." Jake paused, wary, and the doctor was distressed. Rilvan nodded. "They said the process is painful and carries risks, that it is not something an individual should undertake without proper support." Jake rubbed his forehead. "I know that. I wouldn't have done it if I had another option." Vryn's coloration shifted slightly. "But you did have another option. The professor was ready to escort you to medical aid." Jake exhaled. "Maybe I should have waited. But at the time I just wanted to fix it and move on." Rilvan narrowed his many eyes. "This is what we do not understand. Why take the immediate solution when a safer one was available?" Jake frowned, thinking, "I guess. Humans don't always wait for the safest option. If we can fix something ourselves, we do. It's not about recklessness, it's just." He searched for the right words. "Efficiency." Vryn didn't look convinced. Efficiency should not come at the cost of unnecessary suffering. Jake hesitated. "To us, sometimes short-term pain is better than long-term inconvenience." Rilvan's feathers ruffled. "That is a disturbing philosophy." Jake gave a tired chuckle. "To you, yeah, but it's how we've survived." Vryn seemed unsettled but thoughtful. "It is fascinating. Troubling, but fascinating." Before Jake could respond, another student approached. A Thryn, their bioluminescent markings flickering in an unfamiliar pattern. "You are the human who forcibly realigned your own skeletal structure." Jake set his drink down. "Yeah, that's me." The Thryn tilted their head. "We have been discussing your case in the Xenetical Ethics course. There is debate over whether your actions suggest a fundamental disregard for personal well-being or an advanced threshold for autonomy over bodily maintenance." Jake blinked. That's a lot of words to say. Was this stupid or impressive? The Thryn's lights flickered again. "Essentially, yes." Rilvan made a noise of agreement. "We are still uncertain ourselves." Jake sighed. "Well, I won't be doing it again anytime soon if that makes you feel better." Vryn looked at him carefully. "That is reassuring." The Thryn nodded. "Our professor would like to know if you would be willing to provide insight into human medical resilience for our discussions." Jake groaned. "I'm turning into a case study, aren't I?" "You already are." Rilvan clicked his beak. "It is unlikely this discussion will fade soon." Jake slumped in his seat. "Great." Jake sat at the far end of the campus courtyard, trying to enjoy his lunch in peace. This, however, was proving impossible. Across the open space, Students were watching him, some openly, others pretending to focus on their own meals while sneaking glances his way. It wasn't just curiosity anymore, there was something else in their expressions. Speculation. Debate. He had officially become an anomaly. Rilvan arrived first, settling onto the bench beside him with the smooth, deliberate movements typical of the Varaxi. "You have caused quite the disruption," he observed. Jake sighed. "I noticed." Vryn approached moments later, followed by Jorik. The Zelthian's skin was a muted shade, indicating deep contemplation, while Jorik's mandibles twitched in rapid succession. "We spoke with a biomechanical specialist," Jorik said without preamble. Jake swallowed his bite of food. "Oh." "They reviewed the footage," Vryn added. "And they are concerned." Jake paused. "Footage." Rilvan made a soft chuffing sound. "The security system recorded the incident in the lecture hall. It has been analyzed." Jake set his fork down. "Great. So now I'm a medical case study and a security concern." Jorik tapped his claws against the table. "The concern is not about security, but physiology. Your species is inconsistent." Jake frowned. "In what way?" The specialist noted that a humanoid structure such as yours should not be able to endure such realignment without significant risk of tissue damage, Vryn said carefully. "Yet you appeared to recover quickly." Jake rolled his shoulder experimentally. "I mean, it still hurts, but yeah, I'm fine." Rilvan tilted his head. "That should not be the case." Jake narrowed his eyes. "What are you saying?" Jorik leaned forward slightly. "They are questioning whether human pain response is defective or simply unusual." Jake blinked. "Wait, you think I don't feel pain?" "Not exactly," Vryn said, "but the level of endurance you displayed is inconsistent with typical humanoid biology." Jake exhaled. "I felt it. Trust me." "Then why did you not react in a way that aligned with the expected distress markers?" Rilvan asked. Jake rubbed his forehead. "I don't know. Humans deal with pain differently. It's not like we don't feel it, it's just that sometimes pushing through is more important than stopping." Green exchanged a glance with Jorik. "That is what is being debated. Whether your species prioritizes function over well-being in a way that contradicts self-preservation." Jake groaned. "Look, I didn't do this to prove anything. I just wanted my shoulder back in place." Rilvan tapped his talons against the table. "And yet, the implications remain." Before Jake could respond, another student hesitantly approached. A tall, willowy being with smooth, segmented plating over their form. "I am from the xenomedical department," the student said. "Would you be willing to undergo a comparative assessment?" Jake narrowed his eyes. "What kind of assessment?" The student hesitated. "A controlled evaluation of your species' neurological and physiological pain response, for research purposes." Jake exhaled slowly. "You want to study how much pain I can take?" The student's plating shifted slightly, a sign of discomfort. "Not in a harmful way, simply in a way that allows us to understand human thresholds." Rilvan clicked his beak. It would answer many questions. Jake leaned back, staring at the sky for a moment. "And if I say no?" "There is no obligation," Vryn assured him. "But the curiosity will not fade." Jake rubbed his temples. "I just wanted to fix my shoulder. How did this turn into an academic crisis?" Jorik's mandibles twitched, "Because it challenges what we thought we understood." Jake exhaled. "Fine. I'll do the assessment." The student from Xenomedical inclined their head. "We will set up an appointment." As they left, Rilvan watched Jake carefully. "I hope you understand what you have agreed to." Jake smirked tiredly. "I don't. But at this point, I might as well see where this goes." Jake sat in the sterile examination room, his arms crossed as he watched the Xenetical team set up their equipment. The room was brightly lit, with various scanning devices hovering around him, their interfaces flashing in alien languages. He'd agreed to this assessment reluctantly, but now that he was here, he wanted to get it over with. The lead researcher, A scifistory named Dr. Zelvith adjusted their multi-jointed limbs, their iridescent exoskeleton glinting under the lights. Human Jake, this assessment will be non-invasive, they assured him. We are merely observing your neurological and physiological responses to controlled stimuli. Jake nodded. As long as nobody's poking me with anything sharp, we're good. Dr. Zelvith paused as if considering whether that had been a joke. Correct. There will be no sharp objects. A few students from the Xena medical program stood nearby, observing. Among them were Vren, Rilvan, and Jorik, their expressions ranging from apprehensive to fascinated. We will begin with baseline readings, Dr. Zelvith continued. Please place your hand on the sensory pad. Jake complied, resting his palm against the smooth surface of the device. A soft hum filled the air as the screen lit up, displaying a series of fluctuating lines. Dr. Zelvith studied the results. Your resting neural activity is within expected parameters for a humanoid species. Glad to hear it, Jake said dryly. The next test involved mild pressure applied to different areas of his body. The machine recorded changes in his vitals, tracking how his nervous system responded. Your pain tolerance appears stable, Dr. Zelvith noted. We will now introduce a thermal stimulus. A small device emitted a controlled pulse of warmth against Jake's forearm. It wasn't painful, just hot enough to be uncomfortable. Jake barely reacted. Zelvith's antennae twitched. You did not flinch. Jake shrugged. It's not that bad. The researchers exchanged glances. They adjusted the stimulus slightly, increasing the intensity. Jake exhaled but remained still. Still fine. Vren shifted uneasily. That level would cause significant discomfort in most species. Jake glanced at him. I mean, it's not pleasant, but it's manageable. Dr. Zelvith recorded the data. Fascinating. We will now test your response to controlled electrical nerve stimulation. A small pulse traveled through his arm, causing a brief tingle. Jake clenched his fist reflexively but didn't make a sound. Jorik tilted his head. You barely reacted. Jake smirked. It's like a static shock. Not exactly unbearable. Dr. Zelvith increased the intensity slightly. Jake inhaled through his nose but remained composed. Rilvan's feathers fluffed. This is unnatural. Jake shook his head. It's just different. Dr. Zelvith made a thoughtful clicking sound. Your species appears to have remarkable control over its response to discomfort. It is not that you do not feel pain, but rather that you process and compartmentalize it differently. That sounds about right, Jake admitted. The final test involved cold exposure. A localized chilling device pressed against his skin, rapidly decreasing temperature. Jake exhaled sharply. Okay, that one's not fun. Dr. Zelvith observed the readings. Your body is regulating temperature efficiently despite the rapid cooling. A notable adaptation. After concluding the tests, the researchers compiled their data. Dr. Zelvith turned to Jake. Your physiology is indeed unique among the species we have studied. Your capacity to endure discomfort without immediate distress is remarkable. Jake stretched his fingers. So what does that mean? It means your species prioritizes function in ways we had not fully considered, Zelvith said. Your resilience is not merely physical but neurological. You endure because adaptation is ingrained in your biology. Ren still looked unsettled. And you do this instinctively. Jake nodded. Most of us don't even think about it. We just do what we have to. Jorik's mandibles clicked. That is impressive. Rilvan tilted his head, perhaps even admirable. Jake smirked. See? I'm not reckless, just human. Dr. Zelvith made a final note. This study will greatly enhance our understanding of human physiology. We appreciate your participation. Jake stood, rolling his shoulder one last time. Glad I could help. Just maybe next time, study something less painful. As he left the lab, the campus atmosphere felt different. The wariness had shifted into something else, respect. But Jake had proven something that day, not superiority, not invincibility, but that humans endured not because they lacked sensitivity, but because they adapted. And that, more than anything, had left an impression.